The bolt cutters gleamed in the afternoon sun as Margaret Brennan, 52, president of the Riverside Estates HOA, positioned them around the industrial padlock, securing the dam's control gate. Robert Chen, 45, a civil engineer who'd maintained the community's century-old dam for 8 years, watched the security footage on his phone with a mixture of disbelief and cold calculation. 3 months. 3 months of Margaret's escalating interference in dam operations. 3 months of her demanding access to controls she didn't understand, threatening fines for unauthorized modifications, and filing complaints with the county about his monopoly over community water resources. But this afternoon was different. This afternoon, Margaret wasn't just making threats. She was committing a federal offense. And what this HOA president didn't know was that the quiet engineer she'd been harassing had spent the last 2 weeks consulting with the Army Corps of Engineers, the State Water Board, and 3 attorneys specializing in easement law. The padlock she was cutting wasn't just his property. It was the only thing standing between a stable dam and potential catastrophe. Before we explore how Robert turned the tables on an HOA president who thought she controlled everything, if you love stories where entitled people face consequences and justice is finally served, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The harassment that pushed a dedicated professional too far, the confrontation where power shifted completely, and the resolution where an HOA president learned that some authority comes from law, not just elected positions. The first part reveals how Robert endured months of interference that most would find unbearable. Margaret's campaign began with petty complaints, but escalated to demands that endangered the entire community. Every attempt Robert made to explain the technical and legal realities was met with dismissal and threats. The toll it took on his professional reputation, his peace of mind, and his willingness to continue volunteering his expertise for free would push anyone to their breaking point. What Margaret didn't understand was that her harassment wasn't just annoying, it was creating a paper trail that would become her undoing. The second part captures the moment when Margaret's bold action met Robert's prepared response. The cutting of that lock wasn't just property damage. It was the trigger that activated a carefully constructed legal trap. When Robert appeared with documents Margaret had never imagined existed, the power dynamic shifted so completely that witnesses would later describe her expression as watching someone realize they'd just stepped off a cliff. The identities, connections, and legal authorities Robert revealed in those tense minutes would transform him from harassed volunteer to untouchable dam operator. The third part delivers the justice that transformed not just Margaret's situation, but the entire HOA's understanding of how real authority works. The consequences unfolded in layers, each more satisfying than the last, as federal regulations, state law, and community pressure converged. What seemed like a simple HOA versus homeowner dispute revealed itself as something far more serious, with stakes that extended beyond one woman's ego to the safety and liability of every household in Riverside Estates. Here's exactly how it happened. Robert Chen had never intended to become the dam operator for Riverside Estates. When he'd purchased his property in 2016, the 140-year-old earthen dam was poorly maintained, leaking in 3 places, and operated by a rotation of homeowners who barely understood the sluice gate mechanisms. As a civil engineer specializing in water management infrastructure for the California Department of Water Resources, Robert recognized the liability immediately. The dam controlled a 40-acre reservoir that fed the community's irrigation system and provided flood control for 18 downstream properties. One failure during spring runoff could cause millions in damage and potential loss of life. He'd volunteered to take over operations, spending his own money on repairs, installing proper monitoring equipment, and establishing maintenance schedules that brought the structure into compliance with state safety regulations. For 7 years, it had been smooth. The dam functioned perfectly. The community had reliable water. Robert performed inspections every week, adjusted flows during storms, and prevented 2 potential flooding events through careful management. He didn't charge a fee. He didn't ask for recognition. He simply did the work because it needed doing, and he had the expertise. Then Margaret Brennan was elected HOA president in January, and everything changed. The first incident happened on a Saturday in late February. Robert was performing his weekly inspection when Margaret appeared on the access road, her silver Mercedes gleaming behind her. She stepped out wearing designer sunglasses and carried a leather portfolio that she wielded like a weapon. "I need the key to that lock," she announced without preamble, gesturing at the padlock securing the dam's control gate. Robert explained patiently that the lock protected equipment that required engineering knowledge to operate safely. Margaret's face hardened. "This is HOA property. I'm the president. I have authority over all community assets." Robert tried explaining the liability issues, the state regulations, the technical complexity. Margaret cut him off. "I'll be filing a formal complaint about your refusal to cooperate with HOA leadership. Have the key to my office by Monday or you'll face fines." She left without waiting for a response. The second incident escalated 3 weeks later. Robert received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney demanding he surrender all keys, access codes, and operational documentation for the dam within 10 days. The letter accused him of operating community infrastructure without proper authorization and preventing HOA board members from performing oversight duties. Robert responded with a detailed explanation of his qualifications, documentation of his unpaid work saving the HOA thousands annually, and copies of state regulations requiring dam operators to meet specific certification requirements, qualifications Margaret and her board members didn't possess. The HOA attorney went silent for 2 weeks, then sent another letter doubling down on the demands and threatening legal action. The breaking point came in late April. Robert discovered that Margaret had filed complaints with the county claiming he'd made unauthorized modifications to the dam structure. The county inspector who arrived was confused. The modifications in question were the repairs that had brought the dam into compliance. But the complaint triggered a formal investigation that consumed hours of Robert's time, required him to compile years of documentation, and put his professional reputation at risk. When the inspector cleared him completely and noted in his report that the dam was exceptionally well maintained, Robert felt a cold fury settle over him. Margaret wasn't trying to improve HOA operations. She was trying to force him out because he'd refused to submit to her authority. She was willing to endanger the entire community to satisfy her ego. Robert made 2 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to his attorney, who specialized in water rights and easement law. The second was to the Army Corps of Engineers Regional Office, where his former colleague worked in regulatory compliance. Then Robert began researching the dam's legal status. What he discovered made him smile for the first time in weeks. The dam's control mechanisms weren't actually HOA property. They sat on an easement controlled by the original 1883 charter that had established the reservoir and water distribution system. The charter predated the HOA by 90 years. And according to California water law, any structure controlling water resources that served multiple properties fell under state jurisdiction, not HOA authority. The padlock Margaret wanted to cut wasn't protecting HOA equipment. It was protecting state-regulated infrastructure that Robert operated under a formal agreement with the State Water Resources Control Board, an agreement he'd filed 3 years earlier as a precaution, just in case something like this ever happened. Margaret didn't know any of this. She'd never bothered to research the dam's legal status. She'd simply assumed that because it sat on HOA land, it was HOA property. That assumption was about to cost her dearly. Robert spent the next 2 weeks documenting everything, consulting with attorneys, and arranging a meeting with federal officials. And when his security camera alerted him that Margaret was approaching the dam with bolt cutters on that sunny May afternoon, he was finally ready. He grabbed the leather folder containing documents Margaret had never imagined existed and headed for his truck. Everything was about to change. Robert arrived at the dam 6 minutes after Margaret cut the lock. She was still standing at the control gate, holding the severed padlock with a satisfied smile, when his truck rounded the access road. Her smile faltered when she saw his expression, not angry but utterly calm. That was somehow worse. Robert stepped out of his truck and approached slowly, the leather folder under his arm. "Margaret," he said quietly, "do you know what you just did?" She recovered her composure quickly, lifting her chin. "I removed an unauthorized lock from HOA property. You've been notified repeatedly that you don't have exclusive access rights to community infrastructure." Robert nodded slowly, then opened the folder. "Let me share some information you might find interesting. Your full name is Margaret Ellen Brennan. You're 52 years old. You live at 847 Riverside Drive, and you're employed as a sales director for Mitchell Pharmaceuticals. Your husband David works for the county assessor's office, and your daughter Claire is a sophomore at Valley High School." Margaret's confident expression cracked slightly. "How dare you investigate?" Robert continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I know these things because I've spent 2 weeks documenting your harassment campaign and preparing a legal response. But more importantly, Margaret, I know something you apparently never bothered to research." He pulled out the first document, a yellowed page protected in a plastic sleeve. "This is the original 1883 Riverside Water Charter. It established this dam and the water distribution system that serves this entire valley. The charter grants operational control of the dam to qualified engineers or their designated representatives, not to property owners or homeowner associations. The HOA wasn't even formed until 1973. Margaret's face had gone pale, but she tried to rally. "That document is ancient." "It can't possibly—" Robert pulled out the second document. "This is my formal agreement with the State Water Resources Control Board, filed in 2021. Designating me as the certified operator of this dam under California Water Code Section 6002. The state recognizes my authority as superseding local governance because this dam controls water resources, affecting multiple jurisdictions." The third document was a letter on Army Corps of Engineers letterhead. "This is correspondence from the Corps confirming that any interference with certified dam operations constitutes a federal offense under the Dam Safety Act. Cutting that lock didn't just damage my property. Margaret, you just committed criminal interference with critical water infrastructure." Margaret's hands had started shaking. The severed padlock fell from her grip and hit the dirt with a dull thud. Robert wasn't finished. "I've documented every threatening letter, every baseless complaint, every attempt you've made to force me off this dam. I have recordings of you claiming authority you don't possess and making demands that violate state regulations. And now I have video footage of you cutting a lock on federally regulated infrastructure." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "So here's what's going to happen, Margaret. You have 2 options." Robert laid out the first option with the precision of someone who'd spent weeks planning every word. "Option 1, I file formal complaints with the State Water Board, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the county sheriff. The state complaint triggers an investigation into HOA interference with regulated infrastructure. They take that very seriously, especially after the Oroville Dam crisis. The federal complaint means the Corps investigates whether you've created safety hazards through your harassment campaign. And the criminal complaint means you're charged with vandalism of critical infrastructure, which carries significant penalties." Margaret tried to interrupt, but Robert raised his hand. "The civil lawsuit comes next. I sue you personally and the HOA for harassment, defamation, because your complaints to the county damaged my professional reputation, and for the costs I've incurred defending myself. That includes attorney fees, the time I spent responding to your baseless complaints, and compensation for 8 years of unpaid dam operation. My attorney estimates damages around $85,000. The HOA's insurance might cover some of that, but personal liability for board members acting beyond their authority is established precedent. You'd be personally responsible for your share." The color had completely drained from Margaret's face. Robert pulled out a printed document. "Option 2, you sign this agreement. It acknowledges that the dam operates under state authority, not HOA control. It confirms that I am the certified operator and that no HOA board member will interfere with dam operations, access the control mechanisms, or file complaints about dam maintenance without documented safety violations confirmed by state inspectors. The agreement includes my formal invoice to the HOA for past services, $24,000, which is a fraction of what a professional dam operator would charge. And it requires you to resign as HOA president within 30 days. Margaret finally found her voice. though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You can't force me to resign." Robert's expression didn't change. "Actually, the agreement makes your resignation conditional on the HOA accepting the terms and avoiding legal action. If you refuse, we proceed with option 1. If you stay on as president and the board doesn't accept the terms, we proceed with option 1. The only way you avoid criminal and civil consequences is if you step down and allow leadership that understands the difference between community governance and state-regulated infrastructure." He pulled out the final piece of evidence, a USB drive. "I have security footage of you cutting that lock. I have copies of every threatening letter. I have statements from 3 attorneys confirming that your actions constitute criminal interference. And I have friends at the State Water Board who are very interested in how an HOA president thought she could override state regulations." Margaret stared at the agreement, her hands trembling as she reached for it. "I need time to consult with—" Robert shook his head. "You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow to sign and return this. If I don't have it by then, I file everything Monday morning. The clock is ticking, Margaret. And unlike the HOA rules you're used to bending, state and federal law doesn't care about your authority or your connections." He placed the agreement in her shaking hands, then picked up his severed lock. "One more thing. You're paying to replace this. $240 for an industrial-grade padlock, which I'll be invoicing the HOA for. Consider it a bargain compared to what you almost cost yourself." Robert walked back to his truck, leaving Margaret standing alone at the dam. The agreement clutched in her hands, and the full weight of her mistake finally settling over her. As he drove away, Robert allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes justice didn't come from HOA meetings or strongly worded letters. Sometimes it came from knowing exactly which laws trumped local authority and being prepared to use them. The next afternoon, Robert's attorney received the signed agreement via email at 4:47 p.m. Margaret had signed every page, her signature shaky but legally binding. But the story didn't end there. Robert had expected compliance. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly the consequences would multiply. The first complication arrived on Tuesday morning when David Brennan, Margaret's husband, appeared at Robert's door. David worked for the county assessor's office, and Robert had worried briefly about potential retaliation through county channels. Instead, David stood on the porch looking exhausted and defeated. "I need you to know I had no idea what Margaret was doing," he said quietly. "I work with property records. I should have known to check the dam's legal status, but she never told me the details. She just kept saying you were being difficult about HOA rules." David handed Robert an envelope. "This is my personal check for the lock replacement and a formal apology. What she did was wrong, and it's put our entire family at risk. I've spoken with our attorney. Margaret's resignation letter goes to the HOA board tomorrow." But Margaret had one last move to make. That Wednesday, she attempted to rally support by sending a community-wide email claiming Robert was extorting the HOA and threatening legal action over minor disagreements. She positioned herself as the victim, suggesting Robert was using technical loopholes to maintain his monopoly on dam control. The email was a mistake. Within hours, 3 other homeowners contacted Robert. Each had their own story of Margaret's overreach. A family fined repeatedly for a garden that violated newly invented aesthetic standards. A couple threatened with liens over their solar panels. A retiree forced to repaint his house 3 times to satisfy Margaret's personal color preferences. One homeowner, a retired attorney named Patricia Morrison, was particularly interested in the dam documents. "I've dealt with water rights cases," Patricia said over the phone. "If what you're telling me is accurate, Margaret didn't just harass you. She created massive liability for every homeowner in this community. If something had happened to that dam while she was interfering with certified operations, we could all have been sued." Patricia began organizing. By Thursday evening, 17 homeowners had signed a petition demanding Margaret's immediate resignation and a full review of all HOA actions taken during her tenure. The Friday board meeting was standing room only. Margaret attempted to defend her actions, but Patricia stood up with Robert's documentation and walked the board through the legal reality. The dam operated under state authority. Margaret's interference had created potential liability that could have bankrupted the entire HOA. Her complaints to the county had wasted taxpayer resources. Her cutting of the lock constituted criminal vandalism of regulated infrastructure. "The only reason we're not facing state investigations and federal fines right now," Patricia said clearly, "is because Robert chose to offer a settlement instead of pursuing full legal action. We should be thanking him, not defending the person who nearly destroyed this community." The vote was unanimous. Margaret was removed as president effective immediately, with the board formally accepting all terms of Robert's agreement. The HOA paid his invoice within a week. Margaret's resignation letter was posted to the community website that Saturday. In it, she claimed personal reasons for stepping down, but the community knew the truth. Word had spread about the dam incident, the legal documents, the narrow escape from serious consequences. 2 months later, Robert sat by the reservoir on a peaceful September evening, watching the water reflect the sunset. The new HOA president, a retired project manager named Tom Chen, no relation, had reached out personally to thank Robert for his years of service and to assure him there would be no further interference. The board had even approved a modest annual payment for his dam operation services, acknowledging that his expertise had saved them from disaster more than once. Patricia Morrison had filed a formal complaint with the state about Margaret's actions, resulting in a warning letter to the HOA and new requirements for board training on regulated infrastructure. Margaret herself had gone quiet, rarely attending community events and never speaking at board meetings when she did appear. Her husband David had become a friendly acquaintance, occasionally stopping by to discuss property matters and always careful to maintain respectful boundaries. The dam hummed quietly behind Robert as he watched the water. New fish were spawning in the reservoir, the irrigation system was functioning perfectly, and the spring flood season had passed without incident. Everything Margaret had tried to control through intimidation and misplaced authority now operated smoothly under the structure it had needed all along: proper certification, legal recognition, and respect for expertise over ego. Robert had learned something important through those difficult months. Sometimes the people who demanded authority most loudly were the ones who understood it least. Real power didn't come from elected positions or threatening letters. It came from knowledge, preparation, and understanding which laws mattered when everything fell apart. And as Robert sat there in the fading light, watching the dam he'd protected for 8 years continue its quiet work of keeping the community safe, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine peace. Justice, he thought, didn't always announce itself with dramatic courtroom victories. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the form of documents that transformed harassment into accountability, and ego into expensive lessons about the difference between authority and overreach. Across the country in Boulder, Colorado, retired aerospace engineer Dr. Linda Park received a citation from her HOA demanding she remove the unauthorized weather station from her rooftop. Linda smiled, the same smile that had once preceded presentations to NASA review boards, and pulled out the National Weather Service Partnership Agreement, designating her home as an official observation station. "Please keep threatening," she said quietly to herself while drafting her response. "I'd love to explain to a judge how an HOA thinks it can override federal meteorological data collection." The board president went silent after receiving her letter. But that's a story for another time.